This last session is going to be looking at, in the United Kingdom, not all the unions agree exactly how energy should be delivered in the future, whether it's private, never mind public ownership, largely because trade unions aren't committed to the same position. So Unison, for example, I'm Alison from Unison Acts Unite. I didn't introduce myself. Unison has a very progressive policy of 100% delivery of energy through sustainable and renewable sources. Unite has a pro-nuclear approach, so it would have a mixed approach to the future of energy. And GMB are supporting fracking at the moment, whereas other unions have a moratorium or don't support fracking. And PCS as well have a very progressive renewable energy policy, just to name a few of the unions, of the big key unions, if you like. Now, it's not just the role of the public sector delivering the outcome. As we know about the transition, it's about how we get there and what the role unions have in the public sector, delivering parts of the energy supply in that transition, the mix, if you like. There's an argument, for example, that we will need nuclear, although it's really expensive in the United Kingdom, because there's an energy gap around when gas finishes, what replaces it. There's another argument, getting more and more popularity and rising up the agenda, that actually we can just use hydrogen instead. So there's lots of debate going on in the United Kingdom in the trade union movement. Now, there are some contradictions as well around the progressive debates, but I'm going to highlight some of the contradictions where there are agreements. So one of the first things that most unions, if they haven't yet decided how's the best way to deliver all that energy that I mentioned before, the thing that they do agree about is that the UK's current energy system is dysfunctional. And it's not just the labour movement and trade unions who agree that, the actual government itself has agreed it's dysfunctional, largely because our wholesale and retail doesn't work, prices are too high, prices have been going up and up and up for the ordinary worker for ages, and basically it's got to stop. And we haven't quite yet, with this government, which is a Conservative government, they haven't really got a plan to do that. But they have got an excuse, and that's what they're using. The excuse is called Brexit. The United Kingdom in 2016, 2 years ago this June, voted to leave the European Union, and that's caused quite a lot of focus to move away from domestic policy, including energy policy, into what will the new relationship be with the European Union. Now, a lot of the left and all the civil groups have been fighting, and it hasn't had a lot of press, but we've actually been fighting really hard in Parliament to save all our progressive environmental protections, because actually it has been the EU that's been the driver of all the progressive protections we've had. And I'm talking about any regulation or standards, whether it's in a trade deal, whether it's to do with keeping chlorine out of chicken, around food standards, for example, but also just basic things that people in the UK have taken for granted, like polluter pays. You know, precautionary principle, we don't do anything unless we can prove that it's not going to harm. Environmental impact assessments, all this is regulated by the EU. So when the United Kingdom leaves in March next year in 2019, we've had to move all our supreme EU law and dump it into UK law. But unfortunately, this government, because it wants a free trade deal, wants to be able to decide what we keep, what we don't keep, what we're going to get rid of, and what is not going to be necessary. So what we're fighting with the labour movement is to keep everything exactly the same, so it can't be watered down or diluted. And it's not just environmental protections, it's about also our employment basic rights as well. So, whilst Brexit's happening, the government argues everything's a bit uncertain. We've got no money anyway because we're still rolling out austerity. So they've basically not well, basically, they've not just supported any of the current progressive policies we had around the retrofit, the Green Bank deal, and also obligations on energy firms where they had to support renewables, for example. All that has basically been either scrapped or downgraded, if you like. So, whilst we've got the Brexit negotiations going on, we've also got, however, something really good in that everyone believes the market has broken. We've got a broken energy market in the United Kingdom, and whilst we've got that consensus in the trade union movement, which is why we're supporting bringing everything back under public ownership, the Labour movement also elected Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, and what Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters have said is, we need to reconfigure the public sector, and part of that is stopping privatisation, including bringing back under public ownership railways, water and energy. Now, that's quite a big challenge, and we've been working with TUED and the trade unions with Jeremy Corbyn's team. He's got a whole office of 50 researchers who are working with academics and experts on how we do this. Largely probably because no one else, not other country in the world has done it. Particularly, we may still have some relationship with the EU as well, and there are certain rules around competition and market economy, if you like, preferential treatment in energy and transport, which we've worked out we can get around, by the way. But essentially what the Labour Party are saying if they get elected is they reckon they can bring under public ownership water within 1 year. But they can't put a timetable on energy because it's so complex. And we will be updating TUED and Sean on the complexities of that. But it is a very exciting time in the Labour movement and trade union movement in terms of energy, and hopefully if we get a Jeremy Corbyn victory with Labour, it's really going to be exciting, and we really value all the expertise in this room because we'll be coming to talk to you all. And on that note, I'll move on to our panel. Our first speaker is Ruth N. Clotosy, the second Deputy President of NUMSA. Ruth started out as a shop steward in 2006 and has also served as the Gender National Chairperson, should I say, and Regional Chairperson of NUMSA. NUMSA is the biggest metal workers trade union in South Africa, representing more than 300,000 members. And what Ruth is going to talk about now is a bit more about the introduction of the independent power producers that we heard mentioned this morning in the first session, and in particular around NUMSA's response to what we've heard already with very little engagement coming from that project with trade unions. So Ruth, welcome to this panel.
Power. Power to the people. Power to the people. Thank you very much, Comrade Alison. I think on behalf of the National Union of the Metal Workers of South Africa, let me extend our appreciation and gratitude for being invited to be part and parcel of this discussion. I know in the past, NUMSA has always been part and parcel of this discussion, represented by our Deputy General Secretary, Comrade Klute, and then even before that, Comrade Dinga Sikwebu has always been part and parcel of this discussion. I think once more, thank you very much for inviting us as NUMSA. Who are we as NUMSA? NUMSA represents 360,000 metal workers in the steel, engineering, transportation, energy, mining, just to mention a few. In 2013, we've extended our scope and we are now organizing across the value chain. Our goal is to promote the interest of our members in relation to the employers and the interest of the country by championing a job-led industrial strategy that can grow the economy, that can create jobs in the labor market. We believe that capitalism has no solution for problems that confront humanity, That's why we remain agitators and promoters of socialism. Just to give a bit of a background on the socio-economic crisis that is confronting South Africa. South Africa has a population of about 57 million. The greatest determinant of poverty and income inequality is unemployment. Unemployment rate is sitting at 37% and continue to lead globally in terms of inequality. According to the Oxfam 2018 report, the gap between the ordinary worker and the CEO was sitting at around 1,728, and it has worsened since then. Approximately 30.4 million South Africans currently live in poverty. This means that over half of the South African population is living on an income which is less than 992 rands per month. The average wage of the African worker in this country is a poverty wage, incapable of sustaining life. That is why, as NUMSA, we reject the current labor law amendment with contempt. We reject the 3,500 rand national minimum wage as proposed by the ANC government. We were told today that these bills were signed by the National Council of Provinces in the parliament today, which is a sad day for workers in South Africa. The focus of my discussion is what has been the union effort to reclaim and defend energy, transport, and other services. I will be focusing on the energy sector. Our key observation of the energy sector is that South African economy has been heavily reliant on cheap and abundant coal. Mining and coal energy are central to the mineral energy complex, which is the accumulation model in South Africa. Over 85% of coal supplied to Eskom remain concentrated in the mining houses such as Anglo American, Exxaro, BHP Billiton. Mining grew through its reliance on the coal energy and coal industry. Eskom is the major distribution of transmission of energy and has a customer base of 5.5 million. For generation, Eskom used the capacity of about 47,000 megawatts. Eskom, the Department of Energy, has recently stated that South Africa has an excess of generation capacity. Both electricity supply and coal sector are undergoing rapid change as a result of global economic crisis, which now threatens the erosion of the mineral energy complex, especially its centrality to the economy. Eskom faces financial crisis. There's a corruption that is taking place within the board on how tenders are being issued out. And one of the things that also contributed to the financial crisis is the decision to build both Medupi and Kusile power station, which cost billions and billions. The power shortages, which is the load shedding as we normally call it in South Africa, that took place around 2015, there was an investigation that was summoned just to check as to what is it that prompted or that led to the shortage of electricity. And the dating report of investigation came to a conclusion that the past load shedding was as a result of poor management and could have been avoided. Our national energy regulator is not sufficiently independent or proactive in championing ordinary people's interest. This crisis in Eskom is important to the transition to the low carbon and renewable energy. Renewable energy opportunities should not be treated primarily as business opportunities, but understood for the full social value that can be derived from inclusive development with pro-poor government support. Renewable energies can be people's power, but may not be if it is only supported as an opportunity for the private sector. Why we shouldn't celebrate the renewable energy through the independent power producers? The Renewable Independent Power Producers is private sector driven program with profit as the main objective. It opens the development of the renewable sector to domination by a multinational corporation and potentially compromises energy sovereignty. And over and above that, renewable energy independent power producers will make South Africa a consumer and the importer of foreign produced technologies. Bidding makes the exercise expensive and renewable energy less competitive. This renewable independent power producers is too much focused on the grid and security of supply for corporates when we still have a number of households not connected to the grid. What the focus of the grid also misses out is that the provision of energy needs to those who remain off grid. How renewable energy can be an important lever that women can use in their struggle for equality. Renewable energy as a non-commercial means of subsistence. It also misses out that the renewable energy as part of the larger efforts towards energy democratization, energy equality, and the restructuring of society away from production for profit. What is happening in South Africa today in relation to these independent power producers? We've got a case study in one of our provinces. You know, South Africa, we don't have states. We've got 9 provinces. Remember, South Africa, it's not a federal country like here in the US. So we've got 9 provinces. So I'll be relating a case study of one of our provinces, which is the Northern Cape. The South African Renewable Energy Program, through these independent power producers, has been underperforming in terms of job creation, while overperforming in terms of attracting investors. There are more than 95 solar plants projects, including wind, turbines, and hydro plants. Majority of the solar plants are based in the Northern Cape, like I've indicated. The government has invested billions of rand, and 99% of this are foreign owned. Operations and maintenance is also run by the Spanish. Currently, NUMSA organizes more than 10 solar plants where we have collective agreement in place. These plants employ not more than 150 employees in different plants. And this is not what was purported by the government. Challenges faced by the union. Security is very tight in the solar plants. Access is not easy. It is difficult to negotiate with this employer since some pretend not to understand the role of trade unions in the workplace. Recruiting these workers is very difficult as employers and managers are from foreign countries and they don't like trade unions. The employers are always complaining that they don't generate or they owe banks a lot of money. Some refuse to give increase and they say they will go bankrupt. There's a huge disparity in terms of salaries and conditions of employment. Foreign employees are getting much more salary than the South Africans. The employers are paying for accommodation and hotels close to 60,000 rands per month for the foreign counterparts, and South African citizens don't get that. We are struggling to bring all employers under one roof for centralized bargaining, and they refuse to be part of that process. We are negotiating under difficult conditions, plant by plant as it stands. In some plant, government officials have shares, and yet workers don't have. There is a social and the labor plan to uplift these rural communities. The strategy that we've employed as the union. As NUMSA, We'll continue to negotiate plant by plant. It is our hope that the employer will respond positively on the call for a centralized bargaining. We are having the regional program to target these solar plants. What is the alternative that we are arguing for as NUMSA? We are saying that there must be an extended call for public and democratic control of energy to renewable sector and build a socially owned renewable sector. What does this mean? It means building a system where the primary aim of introducing the renewable energy is universal, has universal access and energy self-sufficiency. Prioritization of renewable energy within the grid system. Unions and community organizations must act as catalysts in the establishment of the renewable energy cooperatives and other forms of community energy enterprises. What does this mean to have a public and democratic control of renewable energy? It means building renewable energy parastatals and municipal-owned renewable energies entities that are under democratic control with a social mandate. Bringing sites with the greatest abundance of usable renewable energy sources, such as land under public and community or collective ownership. The IPP's court interdict. On the 12th of March, NUMSA, together with the Transform RSA, we approach the High Court overnight to interdict the Minister of Energy in signing additional 27 independent power producers. I must say that we won the interdict and the matter was set for the 27th of March. And we lost in court on the agency, but when it comes to the substance of the matter, it's still pending. We cannot be fighting corruption and keep quiet as NUMSA when it's done by someone else. NUMSA has always been in the forefront in challenging corruption under Zuma's administration. Some in the list of these 27 independent power producers, they are linked to the current president of the country, President Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa's niece owns one of the independent power producers, Motsepe, which is I think it's the son-in-law of the current president, owns the Rainbow Independent Power Producers. Therefore, why must we keep quiet as NUMSA? NUMSA can be counted amongst few formation in South Africa who developed and continues to develop progressive and class perspective on socially owned renewable energies. As back as 2011, NUMSA called for a socially owned renewable energy sector. In this regard, our 9th National Congress, which is the highest decision-making body, adopted a resolution on how we must build a socially owned renewable energy. We remain very resolute in challenging and opposing the unilateral decision made in how the renewable energies are introduced without any just transition, which will make thousands of people losing their jobs. I must say that when we were challenging the minister on signing these 27 independent power producers, NUMSA's position was interpreted in different ways. Hence, as NUMSA, we are saying that we're still committed to our resolution. Workers and communities stand not to benefit in what is another capitalist grab to enrich a few and to commodify natural resources for profitable sale in the world market. For these reasons, NUMSA is of the firm conviction that the building of a socially owned renewable sector in South Africa is the best possible option for our country's energy needs. The government has now signed these 27 independent power producers. We are still in consultation with our lawyers. Like I've indicated earlier on, that we've only lost on agency, but not on the substance of the matter. We have realized that the current structure of the proposed energy mix gives indication that there's a clear intention to turn South African energy into a hallmark energy production of industrial capitalism. The just transition will be one that promotes an agenda of social justice, sustainable development, and distribution in the context of a just transition to a low-carbon economy. The just transition must be talking to the 100% South African artisan skill. What will happen to the current jobs and the job creation in the social-owned renewable sector? Addressing the class interest built into the South African energy system. The just transition should be looking at the transparency and accountability, particularly on the part of Eskom and other public enterprises, and including full disclosure of the operational status and prospects of Eskom existing generation plans, and evaluation of the potential costs and benefits of early retirement versus refurbishment with full compliance with environmental standards. The just transition must be talking to increasing the allowance for free basic electricity and free basic alternative energy, and ensuring that such provisions are implemented for all households. I think Joshua is correct that as NUMSA, NUMSA is one of the organizations that we've adopted the progressive resolutions, like I've indicated earlier on. Work has been done in participating in policy positions, but we did not push as much as it was expected. The announcement of the closure of the 5 power stations and the signing of another 27 independent power producers has resuscitated our focus and push towards social unionism. We have collaborations and started having dialogues with communities of the Northern Cape and Mpumalanga, and we've started educating our members through research and development group. That will be the end of my presentation. I thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. That was really informative and great to hear the work that NUMSA is doing resisting privatisation. We've had a big fight in the UK around the way that Carillion just basically completely had no interest in what workers' pensions were or anything, and the executive board have now been banned from ever running a company again in the name of public service. So carry on that fight, because legal battles are really important as well.
Can you tell them who Carillion is?
Carillion is a private company, or was, should I say, which basically ran public services and a variety of public services, but mainly building hospitals, schools. It then, after austerity, realised that these contracts were drying up, so it then diversified into facilitation, maintenance of buildings, etc. But really what they did was to try and get the contracts and try and show how they had money to put into winning contracts. They were on some sort of pyramid of hedge fund gambles all the time. So as soon as they got one bit of money, they paid off another bit of money. So it was like a stack of cards, which eventually shows you how these companies are not regulated enough in running public services. And that's why in the UK, certainly Carillion and other companies like that are now have much lower trust than ever before. And the legal battles are really important in showing these board hedge funders, for example, that it's not acceptable, and more transparency and accountability is certainly needed. So just moving on to our next panellist, and I'd like to introduce Peter Knowlton. Peter is the General President of the United Electrical Radio Machine Workers of America. For the last 35 years, Peter has organised, serviced and allegedly raised hell, it says, and represented members and locals for the union from Massachusetts to California, but primarily in New England. The UE is an independent democratic rank and file labour union representing workers in both the private and public sectors across the United States. And I think that lay democracy is very important to the culture and ethos of the UE union. And also, they have a very transparent and open policy around the just transition and how there's no choice really between jobs and the environment, but they both have to be linked into the future. So, Peter, I'll leave it there if you'd like to go on.
Thank you, Alison. First, I'd really like to thank the TUED for inviting us and me to be able to speak here today with you, and especially to Brother Sweeney, who, in his inevitable way, usually puts me on a panel because he can't figure out what other trade unionists from the U.S. It would be more appropriate to be sitting here. And I'm here to talk about public power in the U.S., and it's a pretty depressing subject, actually, not just around public power, but also about just transition and building a renewable energy movement in the U.S. amongst the trade union movement. Just for those people who don't know, the UE, we are one of the founding unions of the CIO. Back in the 30s, we were one of the 11 unions that was targeted by the U.S. government, General Electric, Westinghouse, the largest corporations, and the Catholic Church to destroy us. Us and the longshore workers are the only two that have survived. To date, we're the only two that are still around. So we left, stopped paying per capita, the CIO in the late 40s. We've been independent ever since, have a very strong relationship with the trade union movement in the U.S. However, participate in central labor councils, all that kind of ball of wax. But we do have a very progressive position on renewable energy and on just transition. We're one of the few unions in the U.S. that calls for public power. That's sort of what we're supposed to talk about here today. But my comments dealing with public power are going to be very short, which is more of an indication of not the lack of my own research, but the lack of movement around public power in the United States. Most of the public power capacity we have in the United States has been around for decades. A lot of it comes out of the Work Progress Administration back in the 30s and in the 40s. And also there are some very small utilities around the country, mostly in municipalities. I live in southeastern Massachusetts. My utility is called Eversource, which before that was called Northstar, which before that was called National Grid, which before that was called Boston Commonwealth Edison. So we've gone through a number of companies in my neck of the woods, and the power that I receive and is some of the highest electrical rates in the country where I live. However, just north of me, in a city called Taunton, Massachusetts, which has its own municipal power plant, has some of the lowest electrical rates of any community in the country. And I think that is probably true of most electrical municipalities throughout the country, that they have some of the lowest electrical rates in the country. And it's a real good sort of combine and contrast for many of us in the trade union movement to look at exactly what it is and what the rates are and how it helps our communities by being public versus by being private. And just as an aside, I'll just also say that the municipal utility in Taunton, Massachusetts, also tried 10 to 15 years ago to build a fiber optic network in the Bristol County area in the town of Taunton, and was actually stopped by Verizon. Combined forces of Verizon, AT&T, who wanted a lock on that market and did not want a municipality to set up a municipal fiber optic network, which would not have only provided some of the cheapest rates for internet service, but would have been provided the highest speeds in all of southeastern Massachusetts. And God forbid a private company gets shown up by the public sector. They really don't like that. And they prefer the narrative that if you do anything in the public sector, it's useless, it's not innovative, it's not creative, it's inefficient, which we all know to be a bunch of BS. But that continues to be the narrative in the U.S. And people should remember that that narrative really got heightened under Carter. Jimmy Carter, when he was elected, was the first one to really begin to deregulate our society in the United States, not only privately, but also publicly. And the whole issue of privatization came into play. And then when Ronald Reagan got elected, he amped it up about a gazillion times by busting PATCO, and then proceeded to create a whole industry to destroy the trade union movement in the United States. Now, he has not succeeded, but some would argue whether or not we actually have much of a say-so anymore in the United States as a trade union movement, given that our density is down to less than 30% in the public sector, around 6% in the private sector, for a total of about 11%. So one could argue whether or not we really have much power left in the United States, and we're continually struggling. And I think whatever victories we're able to do is, like in our own union, is despite our size. We punch way above our rate, above our weight most times. But the deregulation and the destruction of the public sector under Carter and then Reagan and then by succeeding administrations has really very seriously eroded the ability for us to even raise that narrative about public power. And it is very difficult not only to raise the issue of public power and how many industries ought to be nationalized and ought to be turned over to the public in the United States. Just trying to have a conversation in the trade union movement about renewable energy is incredibly difficult. We have a resolution that calls for public power. We have a resolution in our own union that calls for the wholesale transition from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy in our own union. Our largest local is a General Electric locomotive factory in Erie, Pennsylvania. Runs on diesel and electric. They're the only company in the states that builds locomotives that has the Tier 4 EPA emission standards. Our members are very keen about building and rebuilding the mass transportation system in this country, but we can't do it alone. And one of the parts that I think is one of the things that's interesting for me is how the Sanders campaign has begun to change the narrative in the U.S. around mass transportation, around renewable energy, around the need to get away from fossil fuels. But it has no way gotten us to the point where you have the trade union movement pounding its fists at the negotiating table, demanding the transition, for instance, from a coal plant to a renewable energy plant, from an oil plant to a set of windmills. It is still very much in a trade union movement, especially amongst the building trades, where they will hold on to whatever they have and the future be damned, despite the fact that they will say to you that we are not climate change deniers. So I think it is interesting, though, how one campaign on a presidential level can really begin to change the narrative, not just around the renewable energy, but also around the whole issue of health insurance, around the whole issue of distribution of profits, the whole issue of our role in society, the whole issue of being able to talk about socialism in the United States, which for those of us in our union and other progressives in the labor movement, we have not been able to talk about that in my lifetime. Not since the 40s, not since the 30s have we been able to have a discussion at the dinner table with people about talking about the isms and about the differences of them and have a cogent analysis and a cogent discussion about them. So thanks to the Sanders campaign, we're actually being able to have that discussion. So I am hoping in the next few years that we'll actually be able to have a discussion not just about the need for renewables, which is percolating in the labor movement, that is happening, but also to talk about renewables as a public sector, as a public good, as something that ought to be owned and controlled by the public sector in the United States. We're not there yet, but the narrative's slowly getting to there. And I know one union that probably has a discussion more than others is the ATU, dealing with mass transportation and buses. And the public ownership of mass transportation is incredibly important fabric of our country, and is one of the few unions that continues to pound the drum around the issue of public transportation, the need for it in this country, and to get away from the use of automobiles. I got 1 minute. Holy mackerel! So I'm gonna end this very quickly then, which is to relay an experience that I had 2 years ago, which sort of lays the landscape of where we're at in the United States when it comes to conversion from fossil fuels to renewables. I was at the AFL-CIO headquarters 2 years ago in a meeting that was put together by Sharon Barrows and Jerky Reyna, Sharon Barrows from the ITUC, Jerky Reyna from who's then the General Secretary of Industrial. And it was all of the major fossil fuel production, extraction, and distribution unions that were there. We were invited, even though we're not in the AFL-CIO, because we're part of Industrial. So we were invited there. All of the major heads of the utility unions were in the room. Sharon Barrows was there, Trumka was there, Liz Schuler was there, Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, Jerky Reyna was there, brother from Unifor was there representing the tar sands, and all of the major utility unions. Every single member of the leadership of the utility unions went around the room and talked about just transition and renewable energy. Every single one of them said, although I am not a climate change denier, we cannot do yet, and they proceeded to list over the next 5 to 10 minutes about why they could not change the energy mix that their members worked on in their countries. And they used the non-union renewable energy sector as the reason why. They used Congress's lack of inability and lack of creativity in terms of a transition of any jobs from one job to another. We have the Workers' Assistance Relocation Notice Act in the United States, where workers get 60% of their income for up to 2 years if your job is impacted as a result of foreign competition. But to be honest with you, sisters and brothers, that system sucks. It's not anywhere near enough to provide a sustainable living for anybody transitioning from one job to another. And fossil fuel energy jobs in the US is 35 to 40 to 50 bucks an hour. So there's a huge amount of suspicion by the trade union movement, especially in the utility workers, for good reason, about any kind of program that the US government would come up with. And we're stuck with this huge contradiction in the US about the need to transition for renewable energy, but how you have a government, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican, who is scared to death of utility and the energy companies and scared to death of implementing any kind of legislation that would give us any kind of meaningful transition from renewable energies to fossil fuels. So it's this huge contradiction where people in the utility industry, on some level, amongst the trade unions, do want to make a transition, but on the other level, have a very convenient excuse, which is we can't trust anybody in Congress to do anything right by us, because they have not done it historically. Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard in the Congress are the only two that have come up with any legislation dealing with a just transition, but it's very small. They're not getting much support in Congress. It's kind of a fairly depressing situation, to be honest with you. But I think that with what's happened with the Sanders campaign, with what's building now, in the discussion in the panel this morning about the need to have a political transition, not just an energy transition, but there needs to be a wholesale political transition in order for that just transition in energy to move forward, I believe is absolutely correct. And we're beginning to see that in this country. I think this year and in 2 years in the presidential election are going to be fairly watershed moments for the U.S. There is clearly a left pole developing politically, not only within our communities, but also within the trade union movement. I think that will continue to be encouraged and will be built. But you're not going to get any kind of just transition in this country, as everybody knows, in this country or any place in the world, without that political transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter, for that update as well. That was very interesting. We have got Trump coming to the United Kingdom on the 13th of July, and most of the progressive Labour movement, but more importantly, our environmental civil organisations are certainly mobilising. They're never going to forgive Trump for pulling out of the United Nations agreement, the Paris COP. So it's going to be a united front against Trump. Our next speaker is Lance. Lance was the National Policy Officer at the Electrical Trade Union, and 18 months ago he got a new job as the National Campaign Coordinator for the Australian Council of Trade Unions, ACTU. And ACTU is the largest union organisation in Australia, which represents 2 million Australian workers and their families. ACTU have a very active international agenda and are big supporters of the just transition, with particular work on campaigning for a structural and equitable approach in the coal-fired electricity sector. And Lance is going to talk to us about how ACTU is campaigning for a transition plan and how the public ownership delivers and fits into a just transition.
Thanks very much, Alison. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Sean and John and the comrades from QED for the invitation to contribute today, and also extend my thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the City University of New York. As Alison said, in Australia, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, we published a paper on just transition at the end of 2016. If people haven't had a chance to engage with that, I highly recommend it. It's available on the web. Just come and see me after my presentation if you're interested in learning about that. The reason I bring it up is the major recommendation of that paper was the establishment of an energy transition authority in Australia to oversee the orderly transition of the energy sector and to ensure that there's a just and equitable transition for workers and communities, which tend to not get as much acknowledgement in discussion around just transitions. It's, you know, yes, it's about the workforce, but it's also about the communities, which are normally regional communities. So, since that paper was published in 2016, we've been busy beavering away in Australia trying to make that a reality. And as Sean mentioned earlier, there's really been two sort of key projects in Australia that have been used as case studies for a just transition. And I'll just quickly give you an overview of those two projects. Both of them are about 12 to 18 months old now. And then I'll give you my analysis of those projects via the paper that QED has just put out about just transition, and briefly touch on the concepts that we've been speaking about earlier when it comes to social power, social dialogue, and where that fits in with public ownership within the context of just transition. So the project that Sean mentioned was or is in South Australia, Port Augusta. Put simply, there was a privately owned coal-fired generator. The private company made a board decision overseas, as so often the case, to close it and left the workforce stranded. There was a community campaign that was run with union involvement, with environmental NGOs, with the local community, like just normal community members. It was a really good grassroots campaign that ran probably the main part of it was about 18 months, but the entire campaign probably lasted about 3 years. And that campaign was to, it was called Repower Port Augusta, and it was to literally put a large-scale solar plant on where the coal-fired plant was. So that campaign was successful. And last year, the South Australian government announced a tender that had been awarded to an international solar company to build a 250 megawatt solar thermal plant. Fantastic, you know, really tangible instance of renewables taking over literally on the spot where there was coal. So from that perspective, quite good. From a transitional perspective for the workforce, not ideal. There's obviously a gap of years between the closing down of the coal-fired power station and what is the construction of a solar plant now, let alone any of the issues with skills transfer, etc. But when we look at the Port Augusta experience through the prism of the paper that QED has put out when it comes to just transition, to me, it really does speak more to an instance of social power, because this was a change that was affected by a community campaign with unions involved that actually led to an outcome. So this was activism that brought about a transitional arrangement. The second case study that I want to tell you about was in the neighbouring state, similar situation, privately owned coal-fired power station at a power station called Hazelwood. Once again, the private operators made a late decision to close the plant, which left the workforce stranded. And there was a different response to that in South Australia, where unions sat down with the state or provincial government, spoke to the companies involved, and nutted out a transfer. It's called the Latrobe Valley Worker Transfer Agreement, and at the time it was the first of its kind. And effectively, what it does is take money from the state government. I think it's about $45 million to pay for voluntary redundancies for workers who might have wanted to retire or change their job at nearby power stations, so that the workers who were being laid off at the closed station could then take those roles. And the Worker Transfer Agreement, which was a legally binding agreement, had provision for up to 150 workers to be transferred under that agreement. So within the paper that UED has put out, that leans more towards a social dialogue approach. Now, there was some social power approach there, because there was some community activism involved with that, but certainly not as much as Port Augusta, a bit of a contrast there. Now that we're 12 to 18 months down the track, and I really hasten to sort of point out that neither of these examples or case studies of just transition are perfect. They're really our first attempt at it in Australia, and they were pretty good sort of results in a really bad set of circumstances. But looking back 12 to 18 months and making an assessment of how each of those respective case studies have gone, there's some interesting results. The social power approach in South Australia with Port Augusta, what we've ended up with there is a privately owned solar plant that is being built with insecure labour hire, casualised workforce. We've had a death on the site there of a worker, and it's still not really delivering the economic stimulus for the small regional community that people hope that it would have. So that's some of the problems with Port Augusta. When it comes to Hazelwood, we're about 14 months down the track, and we've had a number of workers transfer under that transfer agreement from the closed power station, but it's only been about 50 to 70 of the 150 places. And the problem is that the businesses that said they would be taking on those extra workers aren't taking on people that want to work under the transfer program, but are instead bringing in casualised workers to work at the other power plants. So there's been some success, but very, very mixed success in both of those instances. So just deviating for a quick second, we've got a big campaign that's underway in Australia at the moment. It's being run out of the ACTU called Change the Rules, and it's about changing the rules for working people, and it's built off the back of we've had 70 years of inequality in Australia. Wages are stagnant. All of the issues that neoliberalism has delivered in most developed or developing nations, because there is just this huge tangible feeling of dissatisfaction with corporate power. We've put together a campaign that is designed to change the rules for working people in Australia. Now, as part of that is our activities in the energy and climate space as a subset of that. Where we've been really effective in a campaign sense when it comes to energy and climate is using social media and getting out there in the community with rallies and actually having protests, etc. I'll just take you through some of our social media stats. When it comes to energy companies, as you all know, are like the poster villains of corporate power. They're the ones that have all the money, they're transnationals, they never pay their taxes, and they're the ones that are ripping people off because it's the workers that haven't been able to get your pay rises and you can't afford your power bills. So we've really put them up front and centre as pantomime villains in part of our general campaign. So what we've got up here is just some social media stats. I just want to give you a bit of context on our sort of social media engagement. Between the beginning of the year till May, that's sort of where we're ranking. Just a little bit above the AFL-CIO. Sorry about the hubris in that to anyone in the room. GetUp is kind of like Move On. Malcolm Turnbull is our Prime Minister, and he's a Tory, and the Liberal Party is part of the government. This next slide is a very, very typical social media post that we'll put out very regularly on privatisation as part of our campaign. This one was maybe 2 weeks ago, and I won't read it out, you can see it there. It talks about privatisation never resulted in lower power prices, everyone said. We also had penalty rates cut for workers in hospitality in Australia, and right at the moment the Conservative government is trying to bring in corporate tax cuts off the back of what happened over here in the US. So in that particular week, that post was our best performing social media post, and in 1 week it got a reach of just over 500,000 people. So, and this is without Cambridge Analytica or any of that kind of stuff. Earlier in May, we had our May Day celebrations, and in the city of Melbourne, which is where I live, we had about 113,000 people turn out for the Labor Day rally. Thanks, comrades. And collectively, across the nation, we're probably between 250,000, 300,000 people, and that's the biggest that it's been in generations. And the reason that our campaign is resonating with people is because of corporate power, privatisation. Whenever we make any comment about privatisation, you can really feel the passion of people, particularly in the energy sector. And we're in a situation now where the Labor Party, which is in opposition, and the leader is a fellow called Bill Shorten. That's his mug up there, as we say in Australia, his face. But he's now not quite in the same spot as Corbyn, where he hasn't committed to renationalising the energy sector, but he is out there talking about the role of privatisation in the energy sector, and we're supporting him to keep talking about that and go further. So, tying back to just transition now, and when it comes to privatisation, based on those two case studies that I went over, it is clear that we cannot leave just transition to the private sector. Like, that is the evidence of what's happened in Australia thus far. So we are doubly bold now in trying to make sure that we get an independent statutory authority to oversee the energy transition in Australia. We're very hopeful that there will be commitments political commitments from the opposition as we head into a new federal election. And you know, I'll throw, it's a bit glib, but I'll throw another term out there in terms of, if you've got social dialogue, social power, when it comes to just transition, you need to have social intervention as well. You need a strong government that's actually going to bring corporations to heel and provide direct public ownership. And I'll leave you on this. There are some states in Australia where the generators, the poles and wires are still publicly owned. They're normally corporatised, but at least they're still owned by the people. We are close in some of those states, and what we've been lobbying and agitating for is to have the first instance that we're aware of where you can have a complete transitional system from fossil fuels through to renewables that is totally, the entire pathway is publicly owned. So you would have a state-owned coal gas generator, but then the state's building publicly owned renewables, and the state takes the responsibility through an energy transition authority to make sure that those workers are transitioned over, and to make sure that the communities where these projects are, that their economies don't collapse, etc. So I hope that was informative, and thanks very much for your time. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lance. And if you want to speak to Lance further, he's got case studies that he mentioned. He can tell you more about the Energy Transition Authority, which sounds pretty much a good idea, and also Twitter tips, apparently. So just to introduce our last panellists, we have Peter. So we've got David Boys, the Deputy General Secretary from Public Services International, PSI. PSI is a global trade union federation bringing together more than 20 million workers represented by 700 unions in 163 countries and territories. Two-thirds of members are women, work in the public services like social services, healthcare, municipal and community services, central government and public utilities such as water and electricity. And David's going to tell us about what PSI has been campaigning on globally, fighting privatisation, and basically they do say that what PSI says actually runs directly against what the World Trade Organization, the World Bank and the IMF actually propose as solutions to public services.
Thanks, Alison. And I'm aware that I'm the last one between you and your drinks. I'm assuming there's drinks. And those drinks are not just apple juice. And again, thanks to TUED and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And for those who haven't paid your dues this year, please see Sean at the drinks. Okay, look, we're not talking about just energy here. We're talking about universal access to quality public services, which really describes the communities we want, equity and equality and justice. They really underpin the quality of life in our communities. And you can really tell that when your community doesn't have universal access to healthcare. I speak about here in the US of A, education, water, energy, transport, justice, all of these public services that we, some of us are lucky enough to take for granted, others aren't. Sean, in his, again, excellent paper, and I don't want him to get too fat ahead, so we'll take him down a couple of notches over the next 3 days. But he talks about the ownership of the means of production, even though but listen, in public services, we didn't give that up. The trade unions didn't give it up. The workers didn't give it up. It's not part of the deal. So in public services, the means of production are owned by all of us. And so it is not big capital that can decide it. But public services is the next frontier. It is where the cowboys of the financialization and the multinational corporations are going. Sean also alludes to what I've called as the CBA box, the collective bargaining agreement box. If we stay in that box, we're dead. But the problem with trade union leaders is that's their daily reality. They're called on to solve either the CBA or the grievances of current members, versus the long-term need to develop a trade union system that can really protect our members in the communities and where they live. And I think that's what we're looking at. Look, for us, privatization or PPPs or PFI, whichever way we talk about it, is a core union issue for everybody, because you all depend on public services. The other thing that I'm noticing worldwide is in many countries, public service unions are the last ones standing, because the private sector has figured out how to take us out. And they use a range of tools that the public sector is only now learning about. We've heard a lot of talk about IPPs, independent power producers, and power purchase agreements. These are legal constructs to ensure public subsidy for private profits. And the place where we have the longest history of those, and PSI has been looking at them, is in the Philippines. They've been there for 20 years. It was part of World Bank and IMF structural adjustment, which, for those of you who don't know it, was the austerity policies for developing countries, which are now coming to you thanks to your own government. So, look, we're seeing, first of all, in these IPPs and PPAs, the whole privatization agenda, which is run by global institutions such as the World Bank, now G20, OECD, the first thing they say is, first, you've got to destroy the unions. If you want to privatize, you've got to take out the unions. And this is actually a World Bank recipe. They provide that to the governments on how to destroy the unions. And I hate to say, sister, but I've heard the World Bank bragging that South Africa is now the best place to do privatization. You get from inception to signing of contract the fastest of any place in the world. And that means we need to do a lot of work in South Africa. Renewable energy, it's strange. Lance, you said there is a way for public to do it, and I don't know why. But, I mean, Danielle, we've seen in Quebec where Hydro-Québec, the public monopoly utility, is banned from doing renewable energy. So it really is a corporate construct that says it must be done by the private sector. And what we're seeing globally now is a new range of tools under what we call the name of financialization, where they want to do these PPP deals with the government, but what they want to do is create a new asset class so that your pension fund, our pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, so these institutional investors can go in and trade this asset of privatization without having to do the privatization itself, because it's actually quite complex to do it. So we're going to see PPPs as an asset class pushed heavily by the G20, the OECD, the World Bank, our favorite public institutions. Now, as we saw in Puerto Rico, austerity is structural adjustment renewed. It's structural adjustment version 2, 3, or 4. But basically, it says that governments can't either borrow or print money to build what we all need, which is totally insane. And we need to look at how the government creates money. Right now it's through private banks under loans. It's not for building the services that we all need. You heard Lance mentioned it briefly. We haven't heard it enough here. Tax avoidance, or the positive side, tax justice. All of these companies that are going around the world making public, using public subsidies for private profits, they're not paying their taxes. So they're using your tax money and they're not paying what they owe on their profits. We need to look at public procurement. Look, all of these are elements of the fight that we're in, whether it's in South Africa or Canada, whether it's in France or Korea, because as we're seeing, there's less and less confidence in the corporate agenda, But at the same time, the corporate lobby is growing. Just last year, they were given observer status by the UN General Assembly. They've never had that level of reach formally as a power. So, look, for us, well, I hate to say that energy is not a human right as formally defined under the UN system. Water was not a human right, believe it or not, until 2010, when, because of years of fighting, we were able to get the UN General Assembly to vote on it. Now, strangely enough, some of the richest countries in the world, well, they didn't vote against, they abstained, because they realized the potential value of water as a commodity. But nonetheless, we won that, but that, again, that doesn't really solve our problems when you don't have access to water or energy or healthcare or education. So we're part of there's another NGO, Droit à l'énergie, which is trying to push energy as a human right, but energy is more complex than water, that's for sure. Look, we do as a global, what do they call them, peak union bodies? We do global research, similar to what TUED's doing. We were able to analyze the danger of IPPs 15 years ago. And you know, for unions that want to look at the problems with privatization, regardless of which sector, come to us. And so the first thing is, if you don't have the global research, you don't understand the global picture. Your fight is isolated. But if you don't transform the global research into action, then you're just smarter, or not really. So the idea for us is also to identify the actors. When we look at why doesn't a public utility, why are they not allowed to do renewable energy? It's not their own decision. It's a decision coming from somewhere else. And who is making that decision, and how do you push back? How do you make it so politically expensive that they won't follow that route? Possibly PSI's best campaign at the global level on resisting the privateers is in water, and that is a 20-year campaign. We're in this for the long term, and the scary thing is that with climate change, do we have another 20 years? I'm not sure. So that means we need to really ramp up and scale up and accelerate massively. One of the things we learned in the water campaign is we can't fight it alone. Trade unions will not win it alone. And so we've got to go out and listen to the community, learn their vocabulary, adopt their priorities, such that we can create a horizontal network that is not hierarchical like trade unions, but very, very horizontal. And we've got to connect global with local. It's got to be done constantly, and oftentimes, for a number of issues, the NGOs can move faster than us. And we realize that we don't agree on everything with every NGO, but we can agree on the things we agree on and move forward. And we don't demonize each other, but we've got to learn the language of the community and not just of our collective bargaining and grievance handling. Up on the screen, you see one of the transnational institutes research, but again, it's not just TNI. This is the result of a global horizontal water justice network that, thank you for, no, there it is. But what you're seeing is actually there's more in energy. But that's in large part because of what's going on in Germany and the Energiewende. And in water, you see, even in the USA, Peter, there is hope in the land of capital. There's a number of remunicipalizations. These are being done by governments of the left and of the right and of the middle. They're being done with and without public pressure. It's showing that the privateers can't deliver universal access to quality public services. But for us, our resistance is by sector. We have to understand our sector, and I don't know if we have access to the UK We Own It strategy. You touched on it. Basically, the privateers are making so much money that if you guys bought almost everything in the UK energy system, I'm talking about distribution, transmission, most of generation, it would pay back in 8 to 10 years because they're just making so much money. And so there's a whole range of campaigns that are really hot, that are really exciting. I know in energy, the term stranded asset is well known, but this is a term for the financiers, and I sure don't want to talk about us as stranded assets, but that's basically what's happening. Is just transition the concept we need? I think the TUED paper is really helpful for us to think about how we engage at the global and local level. I know that I don't want to be a stranded assets, or I don't want my members to be a stranded assets, but how many of you have either in your unions or in your companies human resource managers? I mean, human resources, we're turning us into commodities. We're turning natural resources and human resources into commodities. It's just how deep all of this is into our mindset. And then the other thing that I want to talk about, so there's the remunicipalization, taking it back, and then there is the concept of public-public partnerships, where public utilities twin each other, and I have a minute, I know, where the public utilities twin without profit, without mergers, without takeovers, and this is something that that we're doing at the global level, but it needs to be done anchored in the local level. Judy, you spoke about nurses going into disaster zones and providing relief. For us in PSI, where we represent the vast range of emergency workers, whether it's the firefighters, whether it's the emergency medical technicians, but also the energy workers, the water workers, it's not just health and fire. And what we're saying is these disasters, yes, we want to be able to provide relief, but it's got to allow the unions to have a political view as to what it is they want their communities to do. And it is during times of crisis that sometimes we can call the question on a whole range of assumptions. And I think that climate change is bringing us nearer and nearer to this point where we have to call the question on a whole range of assumptions that we have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. And David hasn't even had time to mention that PSI have worked with a lot of, well, the majority of European unions around trade deals and keeping public services. So David has got a lot of experience around free trade deals and also how we can protect ourselves and our services on those. Because it's like 1:15 now, what I'm thinking, if this is okay, Sean and Irini, is that we've had great presentations here from all our panellists with lots of information, but I do think we've done actually an hour and 15 minutes already. So what I'm proposing is that we end this session now, and if you'd like to have a chat and have a further discussions with our panellists, then please feel free as we go for our drinks, if that's okay with everybody.
I hope the room's okay with that suggestion. We're going to be here and we can have some informal sort of Q&A with the speakers and just generally mill and circulate the ideas. Just a couple of things. I want to thank Joe Friendly, who's given up his skills and his time to be a true servant of the movement. And I want to give a little plug as we close to you know, the COP24, the UN meeting on climate change, will attract unions from around the world. And the Polish trade unions, we've began a conversation with them, or some Polish trade unions. They're in a situation where they are dependent on one source of energy, coal. They've lost 200,000 workers during the Berlin Wall period, 250,000 workers in coal. Their industry collapsed, and it's really the only energy source they have. And they're being told by the European Union to liberalize and open up their market to private renewable companies who will charge a lot of money for power under a power purchase agreement in the name of protecting the climate. We have to go, if we can, into that space and show solidarity with those unions. They are not the bad guys in this situation. They've got a choice between imported gas from Russia or private renewables from large European-based, Western European-based wind companies. That is not a just transition. So I think we have an opportunity, given the conversation we've had today, given the research PSIRU and CHUED and TNI and others are doing, to put together a strong position on what just transition would look like. And I'll conclude with one statistic, and there are many around this debate, is Germany burns 1.5 times more coal, if not more, than Poland. And yet Poland is the one that is going to be making the cuts. It's only source of power. We don't defend coal as a source of fuel, but neither do we throw workers underneath the bus. We heard from the example of NUMSA. We fight for those jobs, but we don't leave it there. We fight for a transition to publicly owned energy so we can have a planned transition and not the chaos of the market or the greed of the profiteers. That's the CHUED vision. I think it came out in every single panel. And on behalf of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, our colleagues at Murphy, and everybody here, just want to thank you all for what was a very, very stimulating, inspiring discussion. And hopefully we can now go for a drink, which is just outside. So good.